Thank you, Mr. Ford. I appreciate that. When Lee first called and asked if I would serve as a speaker and he gave me the topic, I said, that would take me about 5 minutes. And then as most of you who've ever prepared a speech before, the first time you go through it, I think it took me about 50. So I may have to have somebody over here to give me the wrap-up signal, cut it off or something. So he's prepared. But I appreciate it. I do appreciate the opportunity to come speak to you today. I'll be honest, I'm very flattered to be on such a distinguished panel of speakers. I don't know why Lee keeps inviting me back, but I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you what I know about the paperwork needed at the time of acquisition. I'm thankful for the AFOA and all that they do for landowners to provide you with the information and the education necessary to help you manage your natural resources. I'm certainly thankful for what Senator Sessions does to champion the rights of private landowners, but most of all, I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful that you have voluntarily chosen to participate in one of the greatest privileges known to man in the history of human civilization, and that's the right to own private property. So I thank you, and I thank you for what your ownership contributes to our society. I don't have time to get into a side topic, but I do want to mention that there are actually lots of studies available, one in particular through George Mason University, that will prove to you that the standard of living in a country is directly parallel to the percentage of land that's privately held. So the higher the percentage, the higher the standard of living. And that's one of the great things about our country here in the U.S. is that we're thankful for that high standard of living because of you owning private land. Let's see if I can figure this thing out. All right, I want to start off today by letting you know my presentation is geared primarily for the first-time owner or for somebody who may consider themselves a novice. If you're in the business of selling and buying real estate, most of this you may already know, but hopefully we've got enough information included in the presentation that even you can glean something out of what's being presented. Let's briefly look at some of the things we talked about. Lee and I have been discussing over the last couple of months about what we're going to talk about today. There's lots of items of paperwork that are actually necessary at the time of acquisition. We're not going to go into all of them. We're going to get some of the more important ones. For instance, I'm not going to discuss title insurance. That's typically on the seller side. We're going to be looking at most of this from the buyer side, but some of the 6 things that we are going to include are we're going to talk about recording the deed. We're going to talk about assessing your property at current use. We're going to look at establishing a tax basis. Something you may not have thought about is gathering the names of your adjoining property owners. We're going to talk about estate planning, and I'm not going to get into a whole lot of depth there, but I am going to touch on that. And lastly, I'm going to close out by talking about the need for a forest management plan. The first item we're going to talk about is recording the deed. And I know you're probably thinking, well, thank you, Captain Obvious. You know, we're going to talk about recording the deed. Most people know to record their deed when they buy land, but you'll be surprised that even in 2014, not everybody records their deeds. And that may be interpreted by a judge if your title is ever challenged by another party as failure to give public notice. So it's very important to record your deed. Some of the items that we're going to look at under this particular topic include, we're going to look at a couple of definitions. We're going to talk about the types of deeds in Alabama, and then we're going to talk about the actual recording process. All of the definitions I'm going to give to you today came from a textbook, The Modern Real Estate Practice, 7th edition by Galtia, Alloway, and Kyle, 2006. I want to give them credit because I wanted to have a real professional definition and not just my working definition. So all of these come from that textbook. And the first definition we're going to look at today is recording. And recording is, the definition they give is the act of placing documents in the public record. Now, in most states, any document that affects an estate, a right, or any kind of claim to land has to be recorded in the county where that land is located for it to be considered given public notice. I have seen deeds for land that were recorded in another county. I don't know if that were ever challenged, if that would hold up as a public notice or not, but I know that most states will require it to be recorded in the county where the property is actually located. Most states also say what has to be, how the documents have to be worded for it to be considered a public document. for a public notice document. I noticed in Alabama for the attorneys, they even say what goes in the upper left-hand corner of the document. So there are some specific rules and regulations, legislation that applies to these giving public notice. All right, the next definition we're going to talk about is a title. And sometimes we get this confused with the document that we use to record ownership. The title is not the deed. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But there's actually two parts to this definition. And the first one is the right to or ownership of land as represented by the landowner's bundle of rights. Now here in the U.S., the bastion of private ownership, we, from a legal standpoint, say that if you own private property, you have a bundle of rights, rights that are bundled with the ownership of that property. The first one is possession. You have the right to possess that property. You have the right to control that property, or at least for now you do. You're the primary decision maker for that property. You have the right of enjoyment. It's yours to enjoy as you see fit. You have the right of exclusion. Most states will interpret that rather than you writing a list of people who are excluded from using your property, that everybody is automatically excluded from your property unless they have written permission to be there or to use your property. And you also have the right of disposition. You have the right to dispose of the property. You have the right to dispose of rights associated with the property. We'll look a little more at that in just a moment. So, and the second part of that definition of title is evidence of that ownership by deed. So that you can see that title refers to the ownership of a property, not the written document. That written document is a deed. A deed is defined as a document by which the owner transfers the title of real property. It includes the rights for the surface, the subsurface, and even the airspace. Now, there are some exemptions to that airspace control that you may have if you're near a metropolitan area and there's a lot of planes and things like that. So, but in general, your deed gives you the control of the surface, the subsurface, and the airspace, as well as any improvements which are affixed to the soil, to the real estate. That's one of the reasons that timber is considered personal property rather than real estate, because it can be severed. And so that's what rights you are given to. Your deed is the written portion of your title. It's written proof of your title. Talk about another definition. We realtors and foresters, we like to throw around terms to make you think we know more than we really do, so we use these big terms like appurtenance. You may or may not have heard of an appurtenance, but basically the definition for that is a right or privilege associated with the property, although not necessarily a part of it. The best example of that is a utility easement. Most of you are probably familiar with that. And under this particular appurtenance is you still own the land. You're only giving the utility company the right to use the land. Now there's an easement is different than a right-of-way. A right-of-way means they actually own it. And an easement means you're giving them the right to use it. Some examples, if you've ever been out west, there's water rights that you can, that is a type of appurtenance. Some people who maybe own an apartment complex that has a parking lot that's associated with it, that's considered an appurtenance. The bottom line is the landowner still owns it, but they give the right for someone else to use it. And typically when the land is conveyed, the appurtenance goes with that conveyance. All right, let's talk about the different types of deeds that we have in Alabama. The first one is the general warranty deed. This is the best type of deed if you're a buyer. It gives the buyer the greatest amount of protection. So when you're buying land, this is obviously what you're looking for. It's called a general warranty deed because it has certain legal requirements that the seller is bound by. It'll typically include words like convey and warrant. I heard Senator Sessions mention both of those terms when he talked about a deed just a moment ago. Some states will use the words warrant generally. Let me give you the specific things that a seller is warranting and covenanting when they sell a general warranty deed. The first one is the seller is warranting the right to convey. They're basically saying, hey, I own this, I have the right to sell it to you, the buyer. The next one is they covenant against any encumbrances. Things like a mortgage or a mechanic's lien or even an easement. They're warranting that there are none of those on the property unless they're specifically spelled out in the deed. The covenant of quiet enjoyment. That doesn't mean that it's going to be quiet, you're going to hear birds singing the absence of human noise. It basically just means you're not going to be challenged by any third party, and if you are, the seller is going to defend you. The quiet of further assurance basically means any other documents you need, the seller is going to provide that to you as a buyer if you ever get challenged. And the last one is the covenant of warranty forever. And it means exactly what it sounds like. They're going to covenant that this title is good and clear, free and clear, forever. All right, the statutory warranty deed is the second type of deed we're going to talk about. It offers a buyer a little less protection than the general warranty deed. In essence, it's going to give you two basic warranties. Number one is that the seller did in fact receive title themselves. They received the title, the right to ownership, when they acquired the land. The second thing is that the property did not receive any encumbrances. It was not encumbered during their ownership. So they're giving you those two things, and you can see they're not going back and pat beyond their ownership. So it does offer some warranties, but it's not as good as the general warranty deed. And of course, the deed that offers the least amount of protection is the quitclaim deed. And the quitclaim deed basically just says, if I'm a seller, any title or claim I've got to this property, I'm giving it to you or selling it to you. So it offers no warranties. And in fact, here's some terminology the attorneys will typically write in a quitclaim deed. They'll say they only release, and quit claims their interest in the property. Just because it offers the least amount of protection for the buyer doesn't mean that it doesn't have places where it's applicable. You need to talk to your attorney, though, about that. Okay, we're going to have to move on a little quickly here. All right, the recording process. My buddy Chris Bobo, president of Alabama Land Services, he gives a little outline of how these deeds are recorded at the courthouse. Basically, the circuit clerk will, after the closing, where you sit down, the seller and buyer sit down, exchange monies, they sign documents, and then the deed is taken, or any mortgage is taken out of the courthouse. The circuit clerk will make a copy of every single page and record that in the book. Well, that number is then stamped on the original, and then copies are made to serve as a permanent record, and we can track that over a long period of time. So that's what we mean when we talk about recording. One of the things that is very important for a first-time buyer is to make sure you look into current use. Current use basically means that in Alabama, unlike Georgia, your property can be assessed based on how it's currently being used rather than what it's best suited for. And that could mean some tax savings to you. Here's the Alabama code for Class 3 property. Don't worry about that. Class 3 property is timberland, falls into that. And it basically says that you've got the right to claim current use. One thing I want to point out is if you fail to claim current use, the tax assessor is going to assess it as what they consider its fair and reasonable market value. That may or may not be in your best interest, so you need to check into current use. They use a standard value method, and for agriculture and forestry, they typically have a productivity scale from 1 to 10. Now, they're different for agriculture than they are for forestry, but the general premise is that the more productive the land is, the higher it is assessed, the higher the taxes. If you're going to make the election, you have to do so between October the 1st and January the 1st, and some of the things you need for your application include a description of the real property, usually a legal description. You need to have a general description of what the current use is, an aerial photograph to back you up. That's always a good thing to take with you. We always throw that all-inclusive other information as needed or required by the tax assessor. Now, once you claim this current use, if you do that election, you don't have to do it again as long as you own the property. But when you sell the property, the new owner will have to do that for themselves, and in most counties, the tax assessor will mail them a card telling them, hey, if you want to claim current use, you've got to do it by thus and so date. All right, conversion, if you ever, basically the bottom line here is if you ever convert it from the use that you elected it at, you may have to pay some back taxes, particularly if it's assessed at a higher value. And not only that, you may have to pay them for the past 3 ad valorem years. So there is some risk there, but in general terms, it's worth the risk. So talk to your forester and all about that. All right, establishing a tax basis is something we recommend without getting into all the accounting what's required here. The bottom line, the benefit of a tax basis is to help reduce your taxable income when you conduct a timber sale. If you had your timber basis established at $50,000 when you purchase the land and you sell it later for $75,000, your gain is only $25,000, so that's what you'll pay taxes on, minus any sale expenses or depletion. So you can see that can be a great savings for you. Work with an Alabama registered forester to make sure that you get your basis established. It's also a good idea to talk to your adjoining neighbors. Go to the tax assessor, maybe the website, to look up who owns the property adjoining yours, and you can get to meet them. That's a good thing. As far as estate planning is concerned, the main thing I wanted to touch there was talk about a will. If you don't have a will, you may not think you have much of an estate, but you do if you own property. Make sure you get a will as soon as possible so that your legacy is protected. The last thing I want to talk about was a forest management plan, and Stephen Thomason's going to cover that later on today. He's going to go into detail, but if you don't have one of those, prepare for your property by a reputable resource professional with your best interest in mind. You need to get one as soon as possible. Thank you, and I appreciate your time.